Good afternoon everyone, Country Flyboy here, and today we're continuing the seaplane tutorial. So last time we covered the normal operations of a seaplane, and today we're going to be covering more advanced topics, starting with operating flying boats. I said I'd go over that. So operating flying boats is very similar to operating a regular float plane. If you look at the hull of a flying boat, you will see it's designed much the same way the float of a normal seaplane is. It has a step and a smaller area after the step. Note that on this Mallard it also has a very defined keel and chine. Takeoff procedures are much the same, though takeoff and landing distances may be increased due to the flying boat having a heavier weight and a larger wetted area, which leads to more water drag. Most flying boats have smaller floats towards the wingtips to keep the aircraft from tipping in the water. These floats may be retractable, as is the case with the default Grumman Goose, or fixed in the case of this G73 Mallard. Some, like the Icon A5, don't have this feature. The same characteristics that affect the handling of a normal seaplane apply to a flying boat with supplemental floats too, though they are much more negligible if the floats can be retracted, as is the case with the Goose. Unfortunately, flying boats with VTOL capability have yet to be invented to my knowledge. Sorry, GTA. In the previous videos, we discussed and demonstrated normal water takeoff and landing. So now we need to discuss the abnormal takeoff and landings. We won't be demonstrating them, but you can try them yourself next time you fly the float planes. The abnormal takeoff and landing conditions are glassy water, rough water, and confined areas. Let's start with glassy water, as it's often the more dangerous. Glassy water is dangerous in two ways. One, the smooth water increases the drag on the floats, increasing takeoff distance. Two, the smooth water eliminates visual cues that help gauge height above the water. You saw this during the demonstration video. The flat water texture used by FSX has a similar effect to glassy water conditions, but without the increased drag associated with it. There are two takeoff techniques to glassy water. The first one is just like the normal takeoff, right up to just before liftoff while the aircraft is on the step. The plane may not be able to accelerate the last few knots to takeoff speed in glassy water. In this case, the technique is to use a small amount of aileron deflection to lift one float out of the water and then accelerate further on the step of the other float. Of course, this would make the seaplane turn in the direction of the float that is not lifted. If performing this technique, it's important to not try to maintain a course with the rudder. Repeat, do not use the rudder to keep moving straight. Allow the seaplane to turn. Attempting to maintain straight course will add more air drag, possibly negating the whole purpose of lifting the float out of the water. Because of this, the technique should only be used in light winds with plenty of takeoff room. The second technique is the simplest. Perform a series of donuts at idle or plowing taxi in the water. I'm not joking, just turn in circles a few times. This creates wakes, and it will roughen up the surface and allow for takeoff. Of course, the second technique will likely not work in flight sim, but it's fun to do all the same. Landing on glassy water is more dangerous than taking off, since unless you have a buddy with a boat down there, you won't have any way to break up the surface as you do on takeoff. The main hazard is the fact that the smooth water eliminates the visual cues that aid in judging your height above the water. Look at this picture. Is it upside down or right side up? The answer is right side up, but here's what it looks like upside down. Without anything to aid your height judgment, you may begin your flare too early or too late. Too early and you risk stalling the seaplane and falling into the water on the bow of the floats, causing you to flip. Too late or no flare at all and you essentially dive into the water. The second hazard is increased drag. For the same reason you have more drag to contend with on glassy water takeoff, you have more drag on glassy water landings. This can put even more stress on the floats and struts and cause further deceleration on the water. The simplest method to landing in glassy water is to land near the shoreline, or an object in the water that can provide some visual reference. Those hazards we avoided before might help us in this situation. Just don't hit them. Now let's talk rough water. Takeoff in rough water can be challenging. The idea is to transfer as much weight of the floats to the wings as fast as possible. To do this, flaps can be helpful, and putting the power to full blast right off the bat can be too. Note we do have one advantage. If the wind is strong enough to cause the water to be rough, then that means if we can take off into the wind, we get some free airspeed. However, the drawback is the rough waves. They put a pounding on the floats and the airplane. When ready to take off, apply full power just as the floats begin to rise onto a wave. This will ensure the bow of the floats won't dig into the water. Apply back pressure on the stick to keep the nose high and the airplane in a plowing attitude. Once you're on the step, the seaplane will start to bounce from one wave crest to the next. The shock will increase in severity with each wave you strike. It can even bounce the seaplane out of the water at a high pitch angle but low airspeed. That's bad. To account for this, use the elevators to maintain near constant pitch attitude, allowing the seaplane to skim across the water. This may require both forward and back pressure on the stick. The main thing is to keep the bows of the floats from being pushed under the water surface. As for landing, there are many variables that govern your approach and landing in rough water, so I'm going to describe the technique in general. Ideally, you want to touch the water at as flat an attitude as possible. Do a power on landing for this. In fact, it's a good idea to increase power and level off just above the water and look for the best spot to reduce power and touch down. You want to slice through the water instead of hitting it. As the seaplane settles into the water, apply back pressure to get into a plowing taxi as soon as you can. Above all else, be ready to go around if a large wave throws the seaplane back into the air. And be mindful of the wind, especially if you're unable to land into the wind. It may be a better idea to fly to another stretch of water that might be calmer and land there instead. A long taxi is preferable to swimming. Rough water is a bit of a subjective term. What may be no problem for a small boat could be a real challenge for a seaplane. For our purposes, we will consider sea conditions with a Beaufort number of 5 or better to be rough. That's a wind speed of 17 knots or greater, but even that may be considered too rough. Remember, in FSX, Flight Sim World, and X-Plane, we have to deal with the 2D water texture, so being able to tell what the water conditions will be like is basically guessing based on reported surface wind. You P3D guys get to actually be able to visually see the sea condition. And let's talk confined areas. A confined area can be both a small area of water or a large area of water with high terrain around it. But this is one area where the seaplanes have an advantage over land airplanes. When land planes take off, they have to use a runway and maintain a direction, but that's not always a requirement with seaplanes. A seaplane can accelerate to on-step taxi in one direction, then turn around and accelerate to takeoff speed in the opposite direction. It doesn't have to be a full 180-degree turn. Takeoff in confined area is as follows. Begin the takeoff run going downwind, accelerated to on-step taxi. Then turn the seaplane 180 degrees into the wind and continue takeoff run from there. This technique has some hazards though. You're going downwind at a high speed and making a turn. The wind and the centrifugal force are acting in the same direction, and that can tip the seaplane over. You should weigh the risk with the benefit of this technique and consider the other. The other technique is to taxi to the far end of a body of water and then take off into the wind. Knowing your airplane and about how far it goes on takeoff is very important. Remember, the Cessna 206G at max takeoff weight will go about 900 feet on takeoff at a sea level field on a standard day. The float version goes 1,838 feet on a water takeoff at the same conditions. That's almost a full 1,000 feet further and more than double the land plane turn. Getting off the water is only half the battle. Confined area could also mean high terrain around the takeoff area. Terrain can block the winds, resulting in glassy water. High elevation also means high density altitude. Nothing about this helps the seaplane get airborne. It's times like these that spending the night may be your only option. Cooler temperatures in the morning may make it possible to take off. Even if you're able to get airborne, you may not be able to outclimb the terrain. In this case, circling over the water as you climb is a good idea. But in order to take off from a confined area, you must first land there. Before attempting a confined area landing, you must first consider one very important thing. Can I get back out? Remember, you go much further on takeoff than you do on landing, and if the departure time is later in the day, that means higher temps, which means a higher density altitude. Remember, our seaplane from earlier went more than double the distance of the land plane on takeoff. You must also consider what to do should you go around. Remember, tight turns are not always doable in a seaplane. There's not really a specific technique for a confined area landing. It's the same as before, only you're in a confined area. Some tips I can offer is to keep the slowest possible speed on both approach and landing. Brush up on your slow flight skills, and make sure you can touch down within 200 feet of a predetermined spot. You literally do not have the room for error. One last thing to keep in mind. The techniques I have discussed, they are not singular. You have to combine them with what we learned in the previous videos. You still have to watch for obstacles both on and near the water. That includes wildlife, like birds in the air, or large marine creatures too. You still have to be wary of boats. You still have to be mindful of water and wind conditions. These are the things that make flying a seaplane properly so challenging and so fun. And one last thing before we close out this video. You may be wondering, how do seaplanes get to and from the water? Well, float planes can actually land at a land airport. You can land a plane that only has floats at a land airport. You do so by landing in the grass to the side of the runway. Of course, in real life, this has to be prearranged with ATC and a guy with a trailer, but here's how it's done if you want to try it in the sim. Firstly, plan ahead. Only land the seaplane on grass, dirt, or other soft surfaces. Only use hard surfaces in an emergency. Once cleared to land, aim for the grass off to the side of the runway. Don't land on the side that has taxiways, but do keep your distance from the runway. Remember, it has edge lights, FASI lights, glide slope antennas, all sorts of nasty things you don't want to hit. The idea is much like a soft field landing. In the past, I have said a good landing is not always the softest landing. You also don't want to go too far down the runway. Well, here you actually do want to be as soft as possible, but you still don't want to take up too much room. Make sure you're capable of landing within 200 feet of a predetermined spot before making an attempt at this. Once on the ground, you will quickly start to slow down. You're sliding across the ground and the friction will make it impossible to get back airborne again. All you can do is maintain your crosswind controls until the airplane stops. Once it's stopped, it's a good idea to give the airplane a quick burst of power to make sure you are firmly settled on the ground. Then, shut everything down and call your buddy with the trailer. Speaking of trailers, in real life you can take back off from land airports too. This is done by having a pickup pull the trailer the seaplane is on down the runway until it's at takeoff speed. Then apply takeoff power and pitch up away from the trailer. Sadly, this is just not something that can be currently done in FSX or any sim to my knowledge. We do have aircraft carriers and we can land on a truck, but no one has given us the ability to take off a seaplane from a trailer.